Powerful secrets don't always arrive dressed in gold or wrapped in titles. Sometimes they walk quietly into a room where no one is paying attention. And by the time the truth reveals itself, the very people who laugh the loudest are left gasping in disbelief as everything they thought they controlled slips away. This is the kind of story that forces you to question how quickly judgment can turn into regret. Stay with us, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that twist when you least expect it, and let us know in the comments what you think might happen next and where you're watching from. Marceline Dorsey, a black woman whose skin tone had once made her the target of whispers in hallways and cruel jokes in elevators, stood tall in the doorway of the boardroom, her hand gripping the cold brass handle with steady resolve. She had walked past this very room years earlier as an intern, head lowered, binders pressed tightly against her chest, praying not to be noticed because being noticed meant being ridiculed. Back then she had been reminded of her difference at every turn, asked if she belonged to the janitorial staff, asked if she was lost, asked if she was sure she was supposed to be in the building. Those words had cut deep, and though she had carried them quietly, they had never left her. Now she returned not as the invisible intern they had once pushed aside, but as a woman shaped by those very wounds. The moment she entered, the laughter came like a weapon. A man in a slate gray suit tilted his head, his smirk sharp, and sneered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Is that what you're wearing to a job interview? You'd be lucky if we let you mop the floors in that outfit." His words were not just about her clothes. They were about her skin, her presence, the unspoken message that a black woman could never belong in a room like this. The others followed his lead, their laughter bouncing off the glass walls, their eyes narrowing with that familiar mixture of condescension and prejudice. To them, she was not just poorly dressed. She was out of place by nature, someone who would never fit their image of leadership. Marceline did not flinch. She had taught herself not to. The sting was familiar, like echoes of the jeers she had endured her entire life. She remembered the time a group of executives had walked past her without shifting in the elevator, crowding her against the wall as though she were invisible. She remembered hearing the word diversity hire whispered when she delivered reports they later took credit for. She remembered Sterling Vaughn mocking her years ago in front of an entire meeting, asking if she had gotten dressed in the dark, while others laughed at the way her blouse didn't match their unspoken codes of wealth. Those memories were heavy, but instead of breaking her, they had become her fuel. Sterling sat at the center of the boardroom now, streaks of silver in his hair, but the same arrogance in his smirk. He leaned back in his leather chair, arms spread wide as though he owned the air itself. "Security's that way, sweetheart," he muttered lazily, gesturing over his shoulder without even bothering to look at her directly. The word sweetheart was not just patronizing. It was dripping with the same old disdain that reduced her existence to something less, the kind of casual racism that dressed itself up as banter but cut like a blade. The executives roared with laughter again, emboldened by his cruelty. To them, the presence of a black woman in their space, dressed in clothes that lacked designer labels, was nothing more than a punchline. But Marceline stood firm, her silence deliberate, her posture unbroken. She scanned their faces one by one, memorizing every smirk, every dismissive glance. Her silence was not weakness, it was power. They had laughed at her skin, at her clothes, at her existence. But she let the weight of her composure speak louder than their mockery. Slowly, she walked further into the room, each step deliberate, the sound of her shoes against the marble floor steady as a drumbeat. The laughter faltered slightly, the edges of their amusement thinning as unease crept in. She did not lower her eyes, did not fumble with her blouse, did not retreat toward the door. When she reached the window, she paused, letting her gaze drift across the sprawling city below. Years ago, she had stared at that same skyline from her intern desk, daydreaming about a day when she would no longer be invisible. Back then, she had wondered if people like her would ever rise above the walls built to keep them out. And now, standing before the very people who once made her feel like an outsider, she realized the day she had dreamed of had arrived. They didn't know her name. They didn't know her story, but they would. Sterling shifted uneasily in his chair, his smirk faltering for the first time. "Well, are you lost?" he asked, His voice meant to regain control, but there was a tremor in it now. The others glanced at him, then back at her, trying to reconcile her composure with the image they had painted in their minds of what a black woman in this space should look like. Confusion flickered in their eyes, uncertainty bleeding into their certainty, and Marceline could feel it, the balance in the room tilting. For the first time, she held the advantage. Her silence was louder than their laughter. She did not need to explain her clothes, her presence, or her worth. All she had to do was stand, unyielding, and wait, because she knew the truth was coming, and when it did, their laughter would never echo in this boardroom again. Marceline remained standing as the laughter rolled on, echoing off the pristine glass walls like a chorus of mockery that refused to end. Sterling Vaughn leaned further back in his chair, his smirk carved into his face like he had been rehearsing this moment for years, as though dismissing a black woman in front of his peers was sport, something to be enjoyed over morning coffee. His voice carried across the room, slow and dismissive, his tone dripping with condescension. "Security's that way, darling." The word darling curled in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, meant not as endearment, but as a whip of authority. The chuckles that followed were sharper this time, some executives slapping the table lightly, others exchanging glances as if to say they all agreed that she did not belong. The cruel amusement was designed to crush her spirit, to force her into retreat, but Marceline did not move. She let them perform their ritual of superiority, watching carefully, noting who laughed the loudest, who stayed silent, and who seemed to be taking cues from Sterling's arrogance. The smirk on Sterling's face reminded her of a memory she had buried deep yet never forgotten. She was 21 then, and in turn juggling files and coffee trays, eager to learn and eager to prove herself in a world that had already decided she was unworthy. She had walked into a crowded meeting, nervous but determined, only for Sterling to look her up and down with disdain before announcing loudly, "Did you get dressed in the dark this morning?" The entire room had erupted in laughter, a cruel wave that rolled over her until she wanted to sink into the floor. He had smirked then, just as he smirked now, enjoying her humiliation as though it were a prize. She had forced herself to remain standing back then, too, even as tears burned in the corners of her eyes, even as whispers followed her down the hallway for weeks afterward. That humiliation had once scarred her, but now it burned inside her as fuel. The same man who had once taken pleasure in making her feel invisible now sat unaware that she held the power to decide his future. The executives leaned into their laughter like it was part of some performance. One of the women crossed her arms and shook her head as if she pitied Marceline, but still enjoyed the cruelty. Another man leaned toward his colleague, whispering something that drew another snicker, their eyes darting toward her clothes. The entire boardroom had transformed into a stage of ridicule, each chuckle another nail in the coffin of how they perceived her. They believed she was a mistake, a disruption, perhaps even a lost applicant too naive to know her place. But she knew better. She was not the one on trial here. They were. Every dismissive gesture, every cruel laugh, every smirk of superiority was being recorded in her mind, filed away for the moment when she would turn their arrogance back on them. Sterling gestured again, his hand flicking as though swatting at something beneath him. "Security's that way, darling," he repeated, as if she had not heard him the first time. His tone was sharper now, pushing, daring her to react, daring her to show weakness. The executives chuckled again, though some of the laughter rang hollow, forced, as though a few of them were uncertain why she had not already turned and left. Her silence, her stillness, it unsettled them even as they tried to bury it under their amusement. She looked Sterling directly in the eyes, not blinking, not shifting, her gaze so steady it cut through the smugness in his smile. For a brief second, he faltered, the corner of his mouth twitching before he forced another laugh to cover it. Inside, Marceline felt the old wounds reopen, but instead of bleeding, they hardened into armor. She thought of all the times she had walked home after long days at this company, fighting tears, fighting the voice in her head that asked if they were right, if she truly did not belong in these rooms. She remembered the sleepless nights, the conversations with herself in the mirror, promising that one day she would not just belong, she would lead. Every insult had pushed her harder. Every snicker had sharpened her focus. Every humiliation had built the foundation of the person she had become. Now she stood before them, and though they could not see it yet, she was no longer the girl they dismissed. She was the storm at their doorstep. The chuckles began to subside, not because they felt shame, but because confusion was creeping in. She had not turned for security. She had not stumbled backward in embarrassment. She had not stammered an apology or excused herself. She simply stood there, composed, unmoved. Her silence, louder than any protest could have been. One executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat to mask the unease, while another fiddled with his pen, tapping it nervously against the polished table. The arrogance in the room was still thick, but it had begun to crack under the weight of her calm. They did not understand it yet, but the balance of power was already shifting. Sterling narrowed his eyes, his smirk thinning into a line. "Do you not understand me?" he asked, his voice sharper now, his tone no longer casual but commanding. He was used to his words being law, used to his insults sending people scrambling. But Marceline gave him nothing. She remained silent, her gaze unwavering, her stance unbroken. The silence dragged on, stretching uncomfortably across the room until it became clear that this was no ordinary woman standing before them. Marceline took another step forward, her measured pace slicing through the room like a blade against silk, every click of her heel on the marble floor a drumbeat announcing the inevitable. The executives, still perched in their expensive leather chairs, watched her approach with narrowed eyes, their smug expressions faltering in fragments. The chuckles that had filled the air a moment ago now dying into awkward coughs and silence. Sterling's smirk twitched as if unsure whether to hold its ground or collapse into unease, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. Marceline reached the head of the table. Her presence, commanding though her outfit, remained as unadorned as before. She placed a heavy folder down with deliberate force, the thud echoing like a gavel striking order into a courtroom. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes boring into Sterling's with a kind of intensity forged not from privilege, but from survival, from long nights of work and long years of enduring the contempt of people like him. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding, until she broke it with words that would alter the room forever. "I'm not here for a job interview," she said, her voice steady, low, and unwavering, each syllable carrying the weight of unshakable truth. She let the words hang, then added with precision, "I'm your new boss." The impact of her declaration hit like a thunderclap. The laughter that had moments earlier filled the air now seemed obscene in retrospect, leaving behind only stunned faces and half-open mouths. One of the executives dropped his pen, the clatter loud in the heavy stillness. Another inhaled sharply as if the air had turned too thick to breathe. Sterling's grin cracked apart, his face paling, his posture shifting as he sat upright for the first time, suddenly unsure of the ground beneath him. He looked around the table, perhaps expecting someone to laugh again, to play it off as a joke, but no one did. The HR director, a woman with short blonde hair who had been among the cruelest laughers, blinked as if her brain had glitched, her arms uncrossing slowly as disbelief wrestled with reality. Even the woman who had smirked from the corner earlier now stared wide-eyed, her lips parting in stunned silence. Sterling let out a forced chuckle, desperate to reclaim his authority. "That's cute," he said, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. "Whose idea was this little prank? Did someone put you up to this?" He gestured at the folder with mock disdain, though his hand trembled slightly as it hovered over the table. His eyes darted toward the CEO's empty chair, perhaps hoping that their absent leader would walk in and end this charade. But no one came. No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass walls and the steady rhythm of Marceline's breathing. She didn't answer his attempt at dismissal. Instead, she turned her back on him, a deliberate move that sliced deeper than words. She faced the vast windows, the sprawling skyline stretching endlessly beneath them, the same skyline she had stared at years ago when she was just an intern, wondering if she would ever break free from invisibility. She spoke quietly, not to him, but to the room, her words a reflection and a warning. "I used to sit right there," she said, pointing toward the corner where the intern desk once sat, a spot deliberately placed just out of sight. "Back when none of you knew my name. Back when you walked past me like I was a chair or a wall. Back when you laughed at me and thought I wouldn't remember. But I do. I remember everything." Her words struck deeper than anger could have. She did not raise her voice, did not need to. The calm certainty with which she spoke made every recollection sting. The executives exchanged nervous glances, some shifting in their seats, as though her memory pinned them like insects on display. Sterling's forced smirk faltered again, his lips parting as if to interrupt, but he remained quiet, perhaps sensing that every word he uttered now would only tighten the noose around him. Marceline turned back to face them, her eyes sweeping across each face, making sure no one could hide from her gaze. She was not the intern they had mocked, not the frightened young woman they had dismissed. She was the culmination of every long night she had spent building something they could never dream of, the embodiment of resilience and intelligence they had once deemed impossible. And now she was here to claim what was hers, not out of vengeance, but out of purpose. The silence in the room was oppressive now, weighted with shock and unspoken questions. One of the younger executives, his tie slightly crooked, looked down at his notes as if trying to escape the moment. Another cleared his throat, as though preparing to speak, but the words never came. It was as though they all knew that any protest, any denial, would be useless against the truth standing in front of them. Sterling finally broke, his voice cracking slightly. You can't be serious." He laughed again, weaker this time, more out of desperation than humor. This is ridiculous. "You're saying he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, as if saying the words would make them real. Marceline held his gaze, her voice cutting cleanly through his disbelief. "Serious enough to stand here. Serious enough to hold your future in my hands. Serious enough that the company you've been rotting from the inside has just been placed under my authority." She tapped the folder once, the papers inside shifting with the sound of finality. "And you will listen." The weight of her words pressed into every corner of the room, suffocating the arrogance that had once filled it. No one laughed now. No one smirked. Even Sterling's face had gone ghostly pale, his eyes darting wildly as though searching for an escape route that no longer existed. He had spent years humiliating her, years dismissing her as nothing, and now he was forced to sit and watch as the very person he had mocked revealed herself as the force that would reshape his world. Marceline stood tall at the head of the table, her words still reverberating in the uneasy silence, and she let her eyes sweep across the room, making sure that every single face, every single smirk that had once enjoyed her humiliation, now carried the weight of memory. She did not need to raise her voice. She had learned long ago that the softest words could carry the sharpest edge when spoken with conviction. "I remember," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "Every time you walked past me in the hall, as though I were invisible. Every time you looked through me instead of at me. Every time my name was forgotten even when my work carried your projects forward." Her gaze shifted toward the woman in the tailored blazer who had crossed her arms earlier, her smirk now gone, replaced with uncertainty. "I remember standing by the elevator clutching my files and hearing the whispers behind me, your laughter about my hair, your comments about my clothes, your questions about whether someone like me could ever fit in." Her eyes locked with Sterling's once more. "And I remember you most of all." Sterling shifted uncomfortably, his once casual posture stiff now, the lines of arrogance on his face cracking, as though they could no longer hold the weight of her words. "You used to laugh," she continued, her voice unwavering, "every time I entered a room. You mocked the way I spoke, the way I looked, the way I tried. You thought it was funny to ask me if I had gotten dressed in the dark, to make me stand in front of everyone as you turned my clothes into a punchline. You thought I would forget, that time would erase it. But I didn't forget. I never forget." The room was suffocatingly silent, the tension pressing down on the executives who had once thought of themselves as untouchable. The HR director shifted her hands nervously on the table, the sound of her bracelets faintly clinking against the wood. The man with the crooked tie, who had been laughing the hardest, now avoided her gaze entirely, his eyes darting down to his notes, as though the words scribbled there might shield him from the truth being laid bare. Marceline continued, her voice steady as a river carving its way through stone. I remember bringing ideas to meetings and watching them ignored, only to be repeated by someone else a week later and applauded as brilliant. I remember being told I didn't have the polish for leadership, that I lacked the pedigree, that people like me didn't make it to the top. I remember the weight of being the only one who looked like me in the room, and the way you made sure I never forgot it. Her words hung heavy, and though no one dared to speak, the guilt was palpable, spreading like cracks across the glass walls that surrounded them. But Marceline wasn't finished. She leaned slightly closer, her eyes narrowing. And I remember the day I left. I walked out of here carrying not just my belongings, but every wound, every scar, every sneer you had given me. You thought you had broken me, thought I would disappear, thought I would vanish into nothing. But all you did was hand me the fire I needed to rise. Sterling's jaw clenched, his knuckles widening as his grip tightened on the edge of the table. His eyes darted from one colleague to another, perhaps seeking support, perhaps hoping someone would laugh again, break the tension, restore the balance of the room. But no one did. The woman in the blazer, who once found amusement in cruelty, now looked down at her folded hands, her shoulders tense with discomfort. The man with the loosened tie cleared his throat, but no words followed. The power dynamic had shifted too completely. No one could save him from the truth spilling into the room like floodwaters. Marceline straightened again, her back tall, her shoulders strong. I remember everything, she repeated, her voice louder now, echoing against the high ceilings. And I carry those memories not as weights, but as weapons. Every insult you threw at me became another reason to push harder. Every humiliation you served me became another brick in the foundation I built. Every time you told me I didn't belong, I promised myself I would return to prove you wrong. She let her words linger, her gaze sharp as glass, making sure that no one could mistake her for anything less than the storm she had become. She allowed the silence to return, the room thick with discomfort, every executive caught in the grip of the mirror she held up to them. They had been cruel, dismissive, arrogant, and now they had to confront what their cruelty had created, a woman who had risen beyond their reach, whose strength was forged in the very disrespect they had poured on her. She did not gloat, did not smile, did not indulge in the revenge she had every right to take. Instead, she simply stood, calm and steady, the embodiment of dignity in the face of a history of scorn. Sterling finally broke the silence, his voice low, trembling with a forced bravado. "That was years ago," he muttered. "You're dwelling on things that don't matter anymore." His words were weak, brittle, desperate, and they shattered against the calm wall of her presence. Marceline turned her gaze to him, her eyes unflinching. "They matter," she said firmly. "They matter because they reveal who you are, who you chose to be when you thought no one would ever hold you accountable. They matter because the scars you gave me shaped who I am, and now they matter because they are the reason you will no longer hold the power you once abused." The executives shifted again, guilt and unease running through them like electricity. They had laughed, they had mocked, they had contributed to the culture that allowed Sterling to humiliate and belittle her. And now they were forced to sit in silence as she revealed the truth of what they had done. No one dared to defend him. No one dared to defend themselves. The boardroom that had once been their kingdom now felt like a courtroom, and Marceline was the judge, delivering not just memory, but justice. But instead of letting the moment linger on their shame, she drew a deeper breath and shifted her tone, her voice no longer a reflection of their cruelty, but a testament to her own survival. "When I walked out of this building," she began, her voice steady and commanding, "you believed that was the end of me. You thought I would disappear, that the humiliation you piled on me would be too heavy to carry, that I would sink under it. But you were wrong. I didn't collapse. I rose." Her words sliced through the quiet, her gaze steady as she recalled the years that followed her exit from the company. She told them how she had begun with nothing but pain and resolve, how she had poured both into the grueling work of creating something greater than herself. She worked through endless nights, her small apartment doubling as both home and office, her desk lit only by a flickering lamp as she coded, studied, drafted, and redrafted until her eyes blurred and her hands ached. There were no weekends, no holidays, no breaks. Every insult they had thrown at her echoed in her ears, reminding her why she pushed harder when exhaustion threatened to break her. She refused to let their cruelty be the final word on her worth. She joined to start up a small, underfunded team that most investors dismissed as a risk, but she embraced the challenge with a ferocity they could not match. Her colleagues underestimated her at first, too, her modest clothes and quiet demeanor leading them to mistake her for someone who could be overlooked. But she proved them wrong within weeks, her ideas sharper, her execution faster, her persistence unmatched. When projects stalled, she was the one who pushed them forward. When investors hesitated, she was the one who crafted the pitch that turned doubt into commitment. Slowly, her presence became undeniable. She was not merely part of the team. She was the engine that kept it alive. But even then, the world did not make it easy for her. Investors still questioned her leadership, asking if she was the right face to lead meetings. Partners still assumed her role was subordinate, directing questions to her male colleagues until she answered with such authority that the room had no choice but to acknowledge her. At every turn, prejudice lurked, waiting to remind her that she did not look like the leaders they were accustomed to. And at every turn, she answered not with anger, but with results. She built an app from scratch, staying up until dawn more nights than she could count, her fingers flying across her keyboard, her vision becoming clearer with every line of code. That app became the foundation of her future, the spark that transformed her from the intern they once mocked to the entrepreneur no one could ignore. Scaling it was not easy. There were setbacks, failures that would have crushed others, nights when she stared at bank accounts running dry, wondering if she had reached too far. But every time doubt threatened to win, she remembered Sterling's laughter, the executive smirks, the sting of being dismissed as furniture in a room she had worked so hard to enter. And instead of folding, she pushed harder, pulling 16-hour days, calling in favors, teaching herself skills she could not afford to outsource. Her determination was relentless, her discipline ironclad, and slowly, the app grew. Downloads multiplied, word spread. Users praised not just its function, but the vision behind it. Investors who once dismissed her began calling her instead, eager to attach themselves to what they could no longer deny. Years passed, and with them came victories. Her team expanded. Her app reached markets they had once thought impossible, and eventually, a major company came forward with an offer that validated everything she had endured. $40 million. $40 million, a number that would have seemed like fantasy during those nights of tears and exhaustion. But it was real. She signed the deal, but she did so with no champagne, no lavish celebration, only a quiet moment of gratitude to herself, to the woman who had refused to be broken. That sale was not just about money. It was proof. Proof that she had been right to believe in herself when no one else did. Proof that the humiliation they had tried to bury her under had instead planted the seeds of her empire. She looked around the boardroom now, watching the shifting faces of the executives as she recounted her eyes. Some stared in disbelief, others in guilt, and Sterling in something closer to fear. "You see," she said, her voice clear and sharp, "what you meant to break me only built me stronger. Every late night, every failure, every rejection I turned into fuel. You mocked me for my clothes, for my skin, for daring to stand in this building, but it was that same mockery that taught me to fight harder. You thought I left defeated, but I left determined." Her words pressed into them like weights they could not shrug off, her truth undeniable, her success irrefutable. She had risen beyond their prejudice, and now she stood before them not as a victim of their cruelty, but as living proof that resilience could turn pain into power. The executives glanced at each other, uncertainty flashing in their eyes, and she tapped the folder again, the sound punctuating her revelation. That app was acquired by a larger firm, a firm powerful enough to compete on levels you never imagined. And when that firm purchased this company, you applauded the acquisition like it was a victory. But you never asked who was behind it. You never considered that the face pulling the strings was one you had once laughed out of this boardroom. Her lips curled into the faintest suggestion of a smile. That face is mine. The shock in the room was palpable, the silence so tight it seemed to squeeze the air itself. One of the executives shifted in his chair, the leather squeaking in the stillness, his hand gripping a pen so tightly it snapped in two. Another blinked repeatedly, as if her words had scrambled the reality he thought unshakable. Sterling's face drained of color, his bravado collapsing like a flimsy wall in a storm. He stammered, "No, this can't," but his words trailed off into nothing, leaving him exposed. Marceline's eyes locked on him with a calm that unnerved him further. "You thought you had buried me. You thought I would vanish. But I learned to play a game bigger than yours. I hid my name, my face, my history, and while you were mocking, I was negotiating. While you were laughing, I was rewriting the map of this industry." The HR director swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the folder as if it contained a bomb ready to detonate. "You mean," she started, her voice trembling. Marceline cut her off with a raised hand. "I don't mean. I did. I orchestrated this acquisition under an alias, and you signed the contracts without ever asking who sat on the other end of the table. You never looked beyond the surface. You never believed someone like me could hold the pen that signed your fate." She turned toward the massive windows, the cityscape gleaming in the sunlight, and she spoke not just to them, but to the skyline itself, as though her words were meant to stretch across every office and cubicle below. "This building, these walls, this company, once a prison of humiliation for me, are now mine. The firm that bought my app bought you. And the irony is delicious because you applauded, you cheered, you congratulated yourselves on the brilliance of the acquisition, not realizing that the very person you had dismissed as unworthy was the one pulling the strings." Her words cracked like thunder through the silence, and the executives sat as though nailed to their seats, unable to move. Sterling's face twisted, his arrogance crumbling into desperation. "This isn't possible," he muttered, shaking his head as though denial could undo reality. You're lying." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him, and Marceline leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Do you really think I would stand here in front of you with nothing but a lie? Look at me, Sterling. Look into my eyes and tell me you don't believe every word I've said." He tried, he truly did, but the moment his eyes met hers, he faltered. His lips parted, but no words came. His confidence was gone, swallowed by the quiet storm standing before him. The others avoided her gaze altogether, their faces etched with realization, their silence more damning than any denial could be. Marceline allowed herself to breathe in the moment, not for pride, but for justice. She had not come here to gloat, but to reveal the truth and claim the authority she had earned. "I orchestrated everything under the name Lena Rowe," she said, revealing the alias she had crafted with care. A name that carried no history, no scars, no prejudice attached to it. When I sent my proposals, when I negotiated my deals, you welcomed them with open arms. You welcomed her because you never questioned her. You trusted her because she didn't wear the skin you mocked. But Lena Rowe was me all along. And now you know." A murmur rippled around the table, small gasps escaping from lips that had laughed so freely an hour ago. The woman in the blazer, who once crossed her arms, as though watching a game, now looked as if the ground beneath her had opened. The man with the loosened tie shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming at his temple. The realization that they had been outmaneuvered by the very woman they had mocked years ago pressed into them like an iron weight. Sterling, refusing to surrender entirely, slammed his hand against the table, the sound sharp but hollow. "Even if this is true, even if you orchestrated it, you don't belong here. You don't know how things work. You don't." Marceline cut him off with a single word, her voice slicing through his protest like a blade. "Enough." The room froze. The word was not shouted, but it carried a force that silenced him more completely than any scream could have. "I don't need your permission. I don't need your validation. The papers are signed, the contract sealed, and the authority is mine. You can deny it all you like, but denial won't change the truth. Her eyes swept the room once more, each executive shrinking under the weight of her gaze. "I concealed my identity because I knew you would never accept me otherwise. I played the game by your rules, and I beat you at it. And now that the truth is revealed, you will either adjust to this new reality or you will find yourselves without a place here." The sound of shuffling documents seemed louder than anything else in the room, cutting through the air like a hammer against glass. And when she finished, a neat stack of proposals and reform plans lay spread before them, their future contained within the ink of her work. "Now that you know who I am," she began, her voice steady but infused with steel, "you will understand why these changes are not negotiable." Her gaze moved across each executive, pinning them down one by one as she outlined the transformation that would dismantle the toxic culture they had spent years cultivating. From this moment forward, promotions will no longer be handed out based on privilege, connections, or pedigree. They will be earned by results, by competence, by integrity. Performance will be measured by real contribution, not by whether you fit the image you think leadership should look like. The words struck like thunder against their fragile pride, and though no one dared to interrupt, she could see the tension ripple through their bodies. The woman in the blazer shifted uncomfortably, her jaw tightening as if ready to protest, while Sterling stared at the documents with contempt, his fingers drumming against the table, as though trying to cling to a rhythm of control that had already slipped away. Marceline continued without hesitation. Leadership roles will no longer reflect only one color, one gender, or one background. They will reflect the diversity of the people who build this company, the people whose work keeps the lights on while you sit in these chairs. Representation in leadership is not a favor. It is not charity. It is justice. The words hung heavy, undeniable, and though the executives sat rigid, she saw the way a few of them looked down at the table, unable to meet her eyes. She pressed further. Ethics and fairness will no longer be optional suggestions, hidden in a handbook no one reads. They will be enforced, audited, and lived. Discrimination, harassment, abuse of power, none of it will be tolerated. Not anymore. Because I will not allow this place to continue as the breeding ground of arrogance and cruelty that once tried to crush me. Her voice rose slightly, carrying a firmness that filled every corner of the boardroom. Sterling finally broke, his voice sharp, desperate, trembling with the weight of a man trying to cling to his authority. "You think you can just waltz in here, spread a few papers on a table, and rewrite decades of policy? You think you can erase years of tradition, years of systems that built this company?" His words dripped with venom, but his tone betrayed his fear, the tremor in his voice exposing the fragility behind his defiance. Marceline turned to him, her expression calm, her eyes hard as steel. "I don't think," she said, cutting him off with finality. "I know, because those decades of policy you cling to were nothing more than decades of exclusion. Those traditions you're so proud of were excuses to silence and dismiss people who didn't look like you. And those systems you worship weren't built to make this company strong. They were built to protect your power. And that era is over." The room seemed to shudder beneath her words, and Sterling opened his mouth to retort, but no sound came out. His colleagues offered him no support. Their silence was louder than any defense, and it betrayed the truth. Deep down, they all knew she was right. For years, they had turned blind eyes, laughed at the cruelty, participated in the mockery, and excused the discrimination as part of the culture. But faced with her undeniable authority, with her proof of success and her unflinching resolve, none of them dared to challenge her openly. Marceline leaned forward slightly, her hands resting firmly on the table, the documents spread like a map of justice, waiting to be followed. "This company will become what it should have been long ago," she said, her tone softer now, but still laced with power. "Fair, honest, human. No more promotions for the loudest voice in the room. No more silencing the ones who carry the real work. No more turning interns into punchlines. No more mocking the ones who look different. No more walls of privilege disguised as professionalism. We rebuild now, and we rebuild right." The young intern in the corner, barely noticed until now, clutched her notebook tighter, her wide eyes glimmering with something like hope. Marceline caught her gaze for the briefest moment, and in that look was a promise, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, laughed at, or ignored. She turned back to the executives, her presence filling the room like a tide none of them could resist. "You may not like it," she said, "but you will follow it, because justice is not a request. It is the foundation of the future I intend to build here, and if you cannot stand with it, you will not stand here at all." The silence that followed was not the smug silence of arrogance, but the hollow quiet of realization. They knew they had lost the world they once controlled, and though their suits and titles remained, their power had been dismantled in front of their very eyes. Marceline gathered the remaining papers from the folder and set them firmly in place, a stack of promises and threats bound together by her unshakable will. "This is not a discussion," she added quietly but firmly. "This is a new reality, and whether you like it or not, you are now part of it." Marceline stood unflinching at the head of the table, the reform documents spread wide before her like a blueprint for the future. And though the room remained silent in uneasy submission, she knew there was one piece of unfinished business that needed to be addressed. Her eyes moved across the table slowly, deliberately, until they locked on Sterling Vaughn, the man who had mocked her the most, the man who had built his influence on arrogance and cruelty, the man who had made her humiliation a spectacle for his own enjoyment. Sterling stiffened as her gaze fell upon him, his smirk long gone, his posture now rigid, as if he sensed the storm about to strike. For a long moment, she said nothing, letting the silence strangle him more effectively than any words could. Then she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, her voice sharp and final. "Your time here is over." The words hit the room like a detonation. The other executives stiffened, glancing toward one another with wide eyes, uncertain if they had truly heard her correctly. Sterling's mouth opened and closed once, his jaw clenching before he forced out a disbelieving laugh. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling with false bravado. "You can't fire me. I've been here 15 years. 15 years of building this company, of leading this team, of making the decisions that kept the lights on." His voice grew louder, more desperate, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. "You don't just walk in here with your papers and your speeches and erase 15 years. He gestured toward the others, his eyes darting from one executive to the next, seeking validation, searching for allies who would back his claim, but no one spoke. Their eyes avoided his, their gazes fixed on the table, the documents anywhere but him. Marceline didn't raise her voice, didn't shout, didn't match his desperation. She simply spoke with a clarity that cut deeper than anger ever could. 15 years of poison doesn't deserve another day. The sentence landed like a verdict, final and irrefutable. Sterling froze, his mouth open as though the words had knocked the breath from his lungs. His hands trembled against the table, his face flushed red, and he tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing nervously at the door as if already anticipating what would come next. As if on cue, the boardroom door opened and two members of security stepped inside, their presence quiet but commanding, their eyes scanning the room before locking onto Sterling. He spun around in disbelief, his voice rising in panic now. "What is this? You can't just..." He pointed at Marceline, his finger trembling with rage. "She doesn't have the authority. She's making this up. I've given this company everything. Everything." His voice cracked, the desperation spilling out of him in raw, frantic waves. "I've sacrificed for this place. I've built my life around it. You can't just throw me out." But even as he spoke, the truth was clear. No one in the room moved to defend him. No one echoed his protests. No one stood in solidarity with the man who had once commanded laughter and obedience. They sat in silence, their faces pale, their eyes averted, their fear of Marceline's authority stronger than their loyalty to Sterling. His kingdom had crumbled, and he stood alone at its ruins. The security officers moved closer, their steps firm, their presence undeniable, and Sterling stumbled backward, his hand outstretched as if to hold them off. "Wait," he cried. "You can't do this. You need me. This company needs me. He turned toward the executives, his voice breaking. Tell her she can't do this." But their silence was his answer. Their refusal to meet, his gaze the final nail in his coffin. Marceline watched him with calm detachment, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes cold but steady. She had imagined this moment before, but now that it was here, she felt no triumph, no glee, no satisfaction in watching him squirm. All she felt was necessity. Sterling Vaughn was not just a man who had mocked her years ago. He was the embodiment of the culture she was determined to eradicate, the living symbol of the arrogance and cruelty that had poisoned the company from the inside. Removing him was not revenge. It was the first step toward justice. Sterling's voice grew shrill as the officers reached him, each syllable tinged with desperation. "You'll regret this," he spat, his words trembling. "You think you can run this place without me? You think these reforms will work? You think they'll respect you? They'll turn on you. They always do. And when they do, you'll wish you had me." His words, meant to wound, only revealed his terror, his refusal to accept that his reign was over. Marceline shook her head slowly, her voice quiet but cutting. "The only thing I'll regret is not removing you sooner." The security officers placed firm hands on his arms, and though he struggled, his resistance was feeble, his power already gone. He shouted, pleaded, cursed, his voice echoing off the glass walls in a desperate attempt to hold onto something that no longer existed. But the more he fought, the clearer it became that he was alone. No one stood for him. No one spoke for him. No one cared to save him. Within moments, they had guided him toward the door, his protests growing weaker with every step. His voice cracked one final time as he shouted, "This isn't over," but the door shut behind him, cutting his words short, sealing his fate outside the walls he had once ruled. The silence that followed was deafening. The executives sat in stunned quiet, their faces pale, their posture rigid, the reality of what they had just witnessed sinking in like a weight pressing down on their chests. Sterling Vaughn, the man who had once commanded the room with arrogance and cruelty, was gone, removed not with fanfare, but with quiet, deliberate authority. Marceline exhaled slowly, her gaze sweeping across the table, meeting the eyes of each executive in turn. "This," she said firmly, "is what accountability looks like." The door had barely closed behind Sterling when Marceline turned back to face the room, the silence still pressing like a heavy blanket over every executive who remained seated at the long oak table. Their faces betrayed unease, their shoulders tense, their eyes refusing to meet hers for more than a flicker. For years they had been accustomed to watching Sterling dictate the tone, to laugh at his cruel jokes, to follow his lead in arrogance and exclusion. But with him gone, the foundation of their security had cracked wide open. They looked smaller now, shrunken, as if stripped of the armor that arrogance had once provided them. Marceline let the silence linger, not out of cruelty, but because she wanted them to sit in it, to feel what accountability looked like, to understand that this boardroom was no longer a sanctuary for their privilege, but a place where their actions mattered. Yet even as she surveyed them with sharp eyes, she noticed movement in the far corner of the room, a presence she had not forgotten, though the others had long dismissed her. A young black intern sat quietly, notebook clutched tightly against her chest, her knuckles pale from the force of her grip, her wide eyes locked on Marceline with a mixture of fear and awe. Unlike the executives, she had not laughed earlier. Unlike them, she had not joined in the chorus of mockery when Marceline first entered the room. She had sat frozen, uncertain, but she had not participated in their cruelty, and that choice had not gone unnoticed. Marceline walked slowly across the room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, the sound breaking the suffocating quiet. The executives shifted as she passed, their bodies stiff, their silence louder than any words, but her attention was fixed only on the intern. She stopped in front of the young woman, tilting her head slightly, softening her expression. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone no longer sharp with authority, but gentle, carrying warmth that contrasted with the steel she had used moments before. The girl swallowed hard, her notebook trembling in her hands, and stammered out a single word. "Talia." The name came out small, barely audible, but it was enough. Marceline's lips curved into the first true smile she had allowed herself that day. "Talia," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the name, giving it the recognition the young woman deserved. "Starting today, you're in the executive training program. Report to my office at noon." The words hit the room with the force of another shockwave, though this one carried a different energy. The executives who moments before had sat in fear now exchanged glances, some startled, some skeptical, but none daring to challenge the decision. Marceline had not only dismantled their culture of arrogance and fired their long-standing leader, but she was now elevating the one person in the room who had been ignored, overlooked, dismissed simply because of her youth and her skin. And in doing so, she was making her point clearer than any speech could. Leadership was not about privilege or pedigree. Leadership was about integrity, about potential, about recognizing those who deserve to be seen. Talia's eyes widened, her notebook trembling harder now, her breath catching in her throat. She looked like she could hardly believe what she had heard. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Marceline reached out, lightly touching the edge of the notebook with her fingers, steadying it. "You don't have to say anything now," she said softly. "Just show up. Do the work. Be ready. Because I see you. I see the strength in you that they never will until it's too late." Tears pricked at Talia's eyes, her lips pressing together as she nodded quickly, too overwhelmed to speak but eager to accept the chance she had just been given. The executives watched in stunned silence, some with faint disbelief, others with discomfort, as if the sight of Marceline lifting and in turn into the realm of leadership shattered the very hierarchy they had clung to. For years, they had thrived on exclusion, ensuring that young black interns like Talia were relegated to the background, invisible until they left or broke under the weight of dismissal. But Marceline had just broken that pattern in a single moment. She had made visible what they wanted hidden. She had given power to the very person they would have ignored. Marceline turned back to the table, her eyes sweeping across the room once more. "This is the future," she said firmly, her voice carrying both authority and hope. "It begins with those who were once invisible. It begins with those you dismissed. It begins with those you mocked. They are the ones who will build what you could not. And I will make sure they are given every opportunity to lead, to grow, to succeed, because the days of silencing them are over." Her words pressed into the executives like iron, and though they said nothing, their silence was no longer just submission. It was realization. They were witnessing a shift in power so complete, so undeniable, that even their privilege could not shield them from it. Talia sat straighter now, her grip on the notebook loosening slightly, her shoulders lifting with something she had not carried when she walked into the room that morning: hope. For the first time, she felt seen, felt chosen, felt as though she belonged in a room that had always made her feel like an intruder. And Marceline saw it, the flicker of confidence beginning to light in the young woman's eyes. It reminded her of herself years ago, when she had been that intern, unseen and unheard. But unlike her own story, Talia's path would be different. She would not have to wait years to prove herself. She would not have to endure the same humiliation and mockery. She would be given the chance to rise now, because Marceline had returned not only to claim justice for herself, but to open the door for those who came after her. The executives shifted again, some frowning, some clearly uncomfortable, but none dared to speak against her. They knew the tide had turned too far. Marceline had set the rules, and the rules would be followed. She had given them no choice. But as they sat in their silent discomfort, Marceline felt no sympathy. They had made their choices years ago when they mocked her, when they excluded her, when they refused to see her worth. Now, she was giving a new generation the chance they had denied her, and that act alone carried more power than firing Sterling ever could. Marceline stood at the head of the boardroom for a long moment after she lifted Talia into the promise of leadership, her gaze moving deliberately from face to face, making sure every person left behind in Sterling's absence understood the weight of what had just occurred. The executives who had once mocked her sat quiet and humbled, their shoulders tight, their arrogance stripped away. She let them sit in the silence, let them stew in the realization that they were no longer the arbiters of power in this room, that the rules of their old world had been shattered and replaced with something new. Slowly, she exhaled, her voice softer now, though every syllable carried authority. "I came back here expecting to feel revenge," she admitted, her eyes sweeping across the table. "I thought that firing Sterling, exposing your cruelty, reminding you of what you did to me, would fill the void you created years ago. But standing here, watching you sit in silence, seeing Talia's eyes light with hope, I realize revenge is not what I feel. What I feel is purpose." The words pressed against them like a truth they could not deny, heavier than any punishment she could have delivered. Sterling's removal had been justice. Talia's elevation had been renewal. But Marceline's true triumph was this realization, that her return had never truly been about them. It had been about the future, about turning pain into progress, about reshaping a broken system into something fairer, stronger, and more humane. The executives shifted in their seats, their expressions unsettled, as though struggling with the fact that they were not just losing control, but witnessing the birth of something larger than themselves. Marceline straightened her shoulders, her voice clear and unwavering. "If you choose to stay in this company, you will stay under this new reality. A reality where merit matters, where diversity is respected, where dignity is given to everyone. If you cannot accept that, you know the way out. But if you stay, then understand this: you will be held accountable not just for what you do, but for what you fail to do when it matters." She let that statement hang in the air, her eyes locking briefly on the woman in the blazer who had laughed earlier, then on the man with the crooked tie, then on the HR director who had once led with exclusion. None of them dared to argue. They sat as if chained to the truth, their silence an admission of guilt, and their stillness a concession of defeat. But Marceline knew silence was not enough. Silence had once nearly destroyed her. Action was what rebuilt. She turned slightly, her eyes landing once more on Talia, who sat clutching her notebook with a trembling hand but a steadier spine than before. "You will not be alone," Marceline said softly, more to Talia than to the others. "You will have mentors. You will have opportunities. You will have the protection of this office so that you never endure what I endured. You will rise on your merit, and when the time comes, you will lead with the dignity they denied me." Talia nodded quickly, tears shining at the corners of her eyes, her lips pressing together as though afraid to speak. Marceline offered her one more faint smile, then turned back to the table, her expression hardening again. This boardroom will never again be a stage for cruelty. It will never again be a place where someone is mocked for their skin or their clothes. It will never again be a room where silence is mistaken for strength and laughter is used as a weapon. Those days are done. What begins now is a culture where people are seen, heard, and valued for who they are and what they bring. That is my purpose. That is our future. The executives still sat in silence, but this silence was not just shame, it was recognition. They understood, even if they would not admit it, that the ground beneath them had shifted forever. They had once wielded their privilege like armor, mocking anyone who did not fit their image of success, but now they had been forced to confront the truth that their image was hollow. They were witnessing the rise of someone they had once treated as invisible, and they could no longer hide from it. Marceline gathered the papers she had spread across the table, her movements deliberate, her composure unwavering. She did not slam them shut or wave them triumphantly. She simply stacked them neatly, a quiet act that carried more power than any dramatic gesture could. Her authority did not need theatrics. It was absolute. She looked at them one final time, her eyes filled not with anger, but with clarity. "I am not here to destroy you," she said, her voice calm. "I am here to rebuild this place into what it should have always been. But never forget this, you made me who I am. Your mockery, your exclusion, your prejudice, they forged me into steel. And now I am here not for revenge, but for purpose." She turned then, her footsteps echoing as she walked toward the door. Each step was steady, unhurried, her presence filling the room even as she moved away from it. She did not need designer heels or a luxury bag to make herself seen. She carried herself with more dignity and respect than any of them had ever worn, and that dignity was unshakable. The executives watched her go, their eyes following her, their silence still heavy. They did not speak because there was nothing left to say. At the doorway, Marceline paused for a brief moment and looked back over her shoulder. "Never judge someone by what you see," she said, her tone soft but cutting. "Because the person you look down on today may hold your future tomorrow." Her eyes swept the room one last time. Then she walked out, the door closing behind her with the finality of a gavel striking judgment. The silence that followed her departure was absolute, but it was not empty. It was filled with the weight of her words, with the realization of the change she had brought, with the lesson that none of them could ignore. Marceline Dorsey had come back not as the intern they once mocked, not as the girl they laughed at for her clothes or her skin, but as the leader they could never have imagined, the one who would shape their tomorrow. And though they might resist, though they might whisper among themselves, though they might cling to the fragments of their old power, they all knew the truth. Her purpose was stronger than their prejudice, her vision greater than their arrogance, and her legacy had already begun. The end. If this story moved you, let us know by giving it a like and subscribing so you never miss the next one. Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments. Was there a moment that struck you the most? And tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories reach.